There's a lot of scary out there these days, and maybe the scariest, the biggest threats are the ones that we know exist, but there's nothing that we can do to stop them. We can't see them coming. That's a lot like what terrorism is like, especially lone wolf terrorism. And today on Deviant Off Script, we're going to explore this phenomenon. Is there a way to detect it? Is there a way to stop it? Is there a way to recognize the signs? I'm Dan Szematowicz, and this is Deviant Off Script with Dr. Jeffrey Simon. Today on Deviant, we're talking about a very special, specific kind of deviant, the terrorist and terrorism. And there's no better person to join us to talk about that than Dr. Jeffrey Simon. Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So just so if you've watched the news and you've watched any coverage of a terrorist attack, there's a very good chance you've seen Jeffrey addressing this. But just to get kind of let people know who you are, where did you start in terrorism? What first got you interested in this subject?
Well, actually, is when I started working at RAND in the 1980s. But backtrack a little, I had sort of an interesting journey toward that point. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And when it was time to go to college, most of the people from my high school were going to Brooklyn College. But Brooklyn College was right across the street from the high school, which was right across the street from my elementary school. So I just didn't want to walk the same route for 4 more years. So I went all across the country to the University of California at Berkeley. Now, I wouldn't have chosen Berkeley on my own, but my sister was married to, her husband was teaching there. And they said, why don't you kind of come out there? And that's the late 60s. So I'm thinking, Berkeley, hippies, are you serious? Oh, yeah, it's a great university. Come on out there. So I did. I loved it. But as with everybody in those days, my hair grew longer. But for the first few weeks, I had short hair and I walked around the street like in a sport jacket. And so some people started saying narc, narc. I went out to the dorm. I said, what's a narc? Is it a bird? I didn't know that was the phrase for narcotics officer. They thought I was an undercover narc.
You wouldn't have been a very good one if you're walking around in a sport coat.
Exactly. I would have given myself away.
Okay. And, does anyone have marijuana?
That's right. What does that smell there? So then, and again, it's the late 60s. So all kinds of different philosophies on teaching. So my first English class, the professor said to everybody, we want you to write a paper due, next week about your identity crisis. Now, I'm an 18-year-old kid. What's an identity crisis? So it was like, welcome to Berkeley, which is just great. Start thinking, ahead and everything. And my main regret of my college years, though I loved being there, was that I did not take a class in my freshman year from this brilliant young professor who was teaching mathematics. I just wasn't a math major. But his name was Professor Theodore Kaczynski. And I didn't know that he was going to become the infamous Unabomber and that I would study terrorism. But it would have been a great story, had I taken a class from him. And what was interesting about Berkeley in those days was that there were a lot of protests each year. And, I basically went to class with my friends. We went to class, but you couldn't help but be caught up as you walk through the campus with tear gas being lobbed as some of the demonstrators were getting violent. But the first year, the police and the National Guard, they would lob these tear gas canisters, and then these protesters would just lob them back. The next year, the police had tear gas come out of the exhaust pipe of their vehicle as they drove up and down the street.
Efficient.
And the final year, it's interesting, it's the same thing with counterterrorism as you try to keep getting better technologies. They decided to drop the tear gas from a helicopter flying over the campus. The only problem is you can't direct where that tear gas is going to go. So the wind blew it into the more conservative affluent Berkeley Hills, and it got a lot of the residents who had supported the National Guard and the police against them. So, it's like, lessons learned. But, Berkeley was it was a fun experience. And after that, I went for my master's in political science to Indiana University in Bloomington. And then I finished up and got my PhD at the University of Southern California here in Los Angeles at USC. And about that time when I started working at RAND, it was before 9/11. So there weren't that many people in the terrorism field. And so then, of course, 9/11 happened. But before 9/11, and this is interesting in terms of our responses to terrorism, in 1993, there was a car bombing at the World Trade Center, in New York. Mm-hmm. And it, damaged parts of the center. A few people were killed, but it was Islamic extremists that were involved. So for a number of years after that, the major threat that was portrayed by both policymakers and the media was the Islamic extremist threat.
Well, yeah, and it fit into the continuum, right? Like, Ramzi Youssef tries that. And before that, most of the high profile or terrorism attacks were Islamic in nature, starting with Munich, right? You have Munich, you have Lockerbie, you have, all the Gaddafi being the big bad guy, sponsoring terrorism. So this narrative was already being built up until that first World Trade Center attack in 93.
Exactly. And also a lot of people at that time thought, well, maybe terrorism is over because the hostages in Lebanon had come home already. It was the end of the Cold War. So it was like a jolt again to the people in terms of it is continuing. We're not going to really maybe, see the end right now. Mm-hmm. And 2 years later, when Oklahoma City was bombed, for the first few hours, the media and the policymakers were saying, this is the second shoe falling. The Islamic threat has now gone to the heartland. But it turns out it was an American right-wing extremist, Timothy McVeigh. Mm-hmm. And after that, it was the militia threat, the right-wing threat that dominated public discussion for a few years. And of course, we have the tragedy of 9/11. So, it's interesting how it goes in these, different cycles and the reactions that we find.
I guess from a macro, sort of a 30,000 foot view, it's the Islamic attacks that seem to get the majority of the attention. They are spectacular, in spectacle, that they are loud, they are extremely damaging. But, here in the United States, at least for decades now, starting with, lots of people has started getting radicalized in the 80s and then with Ruby Ridge. And, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security consistently say the biggest terror threat to us comes from the inside. And I think that's still the case. Is that still the case?
Well, it goes back and forth. They'll be different. Yeah. And again, if tomorrow there was an attack from right-wing extremists, that's what we'll be talking about. But if it was ISIS or Al-Qaeda related, that's what we'll talk about. I really don't see it as either or. Terrorism is a diverse phenomenon. We've seen throughout history from right wing, left wing, special single issue type of things. And so in a sense is that I don't think we can say this is the major threat, because then you kind of let your guard down, for the other kinds of attacks that can.
Yeah, your area of specialty is lone wolf terrorism, and it's my impression, correct me if I'm wrong, that's more of a recent phenomena, compared to coordinated attacks by groups, domestic, international, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, right-wing group, whatever, right? Whether underground, like this is a different thing. And, it's almost self-radicalization, self-motivation, but it's tough to wrap my head around. Is that a more recent phenomena?
It is happening in larger numbers than before, but it's not new in the sense that if we go back, and it's debatable whether it really was a lone wolf, but one of the last remnants of a group, which I've written a book about called the Gallianists, were Italian anarchists. But after most of them were deported and kind of basically it wasn't a threat anymore, one of the last remaining members, without any support and sort of almost acting as a lone wolf, perpetrated one of the worst attacks in our country up until that time. It was the Wall Street bombing of 1920. He took a horse and wagon with explosives and detonated it, and it killed 38 people. And it just was shocking, for the country. Now, the lone wolf, and again, it goes back to the definitions of terrorism.
Yeah.
It's something to be a terrorist act. I mean, there's no consensus on what is and what is not terrorism, but it's usually you have to have a political or religious motivation, and you're trying to make your statement with the violent act. But we had a case where it was just a criminal who did it for insurance money. In 1955, it was the first mid-air plane bombing, major mid-air plane bombing in U.S. history. His name was John Gilbert Graham, and he put 26 sticks of dynamite in his mother's luggage, put her on a plane in Denver, and exploded, and it killed 45 people.
Yeah.
And he was executed for that crime, but it wasn't called terrorism because there wasn't that political, or
right. When Pablo Escobar blew up a plane, he was, that wasn't terrorism. That was a targeted killing.
Yeah, and actually,
not so targeted, but you know what I mean. Yeah,
right, exactly. And the worst mass shooting in our country was the Las Vegas attack a few years ago.
Yeah.
And what's unique about that is the authorities spent a year looking every which way to find a motivation, and they concluded we have no motivation. There was really no motivation why Stephen Paddock fired from that hotel at that music festival and killed all those people. So sometimes, and it wouldn't be called terrorism because there's no motive, but I sort of would still put that in that, quasi-terrorist realm, because what's the difference if he left a note in the hotel, I'm doing this to protest whatever, killing of kids in Europe or what it might be, and he has some motivation, and then we say, okay, it's terrorism. But
right. Well, also, terrorism is also, I think one of the intended effects of terrorism is to spread fear, right? And even if the Las Vegas shooter, we don't know what his motivations are, like that spread fear, right?
Yeah, totally.
And now we're afraid of, rightly so, we're afraid of mass shooters. And the mass shooters come in all sorts of varieties and motivations, from the political to the just.
Definitely. And what separates the lone wolf and what makes them so dangerous is that because they're not part of a group, they're not subjected to what I would call, group decision making. So they're allowed to think up any scenario they want and then act upon it. A member of a group may have to, go to the higher ups. Hey, so here's what we're thinking of doing. Okay, we'll do it, or they'll be directed to do it. Lone wolf doesn't have to bother with that. And so they're more dangerous in that respect. They can be more violent at times because they're not concerned with repercussions. There's nothing, and they're worried about alienating supporters. Terrorist groups will appeal to certain segments of some populations or the people who are helping them financially. And they want to be aware of not creating too much of a backlash from their own supporters for a particular kind of attack. The lone wolf can do whatever, they want. The other difference is that because they're not part of a group, there's no communications between members for police and intelligence to intercept and learn about a plot or to arrest a member and learn about other members. Except now, lone wolves are doing a little more talking than in the past by posting their manifestos. But unfortunately, there's not enough time between the time when they post their manifestos and they perpetrate their attack. So even if we may have, state-of-the-art intelligence that so-and-so has posted a manifesto saying, I'm about to do all this killing, sometimes they do that killing an hour later. But these are things that are, being worked on. And
now they're even, going live on Facebook or going live on YouTube, and they're using technology to. And I think that's fascinating. Like, you can argue that technology, social media, the access to information that we have now, it makes it easier to get radicalized. It makes it easier to birth a lone wolf. And I guess like let's set a baseline here. Is there a typical way a lone wolf terrorist comes to be? Is there a general path? Obviously, there's going to be variations, but are there commonalities?
No, not at all. Because what happens is there are some lone wolves who will be radicalized, and a lot of them online. Let's say ISIS calls for vehicle attacks anywhere you can do it in your home country. And so somebody is following ISIS, propaganda on the internet. They're following these messages, and then they, latch onto that ideology and they commit the attacks. And they became radicalized. Before that, with the social media, it wouldn't have happened. Many lone wolves will have personal grievances or psychological issues. There's a percentage that are mentally unstable, but they'll use an ideology as their justification for the attack. They feel via internet or whatever, now they're part of a group. So like the New Orleans attack, it was reported Jabber, I think his name was, joined ISIS. Joined ISIS. Well, that gave the image that he went over there, he was recruited, he went to training. He just simply pledged allegiance to them through seeing things on the internet. So these phrases we have to always, look at a little more carefully, that it's very dangerous because they get impressionable people who now believe that this violent act is justified. And so the lone wolf also, like the terrorist groups, cuts across that political spectrum and religious. We've had right wing, left wing, center. We have single issues. The attack in New York, where the insurance executive was killed, is different from the New Orleans attack.
Yeah, let's talk about that. People would debate it, but technically that's terrorism, right?
Oh, totally terrorism. Yeah. Because he had a motive where it was two things that came out. One, that the cost of healthcare and everything, and he has some personal gripe against healthcare industry, but also he put out corporate greed. So he had these two things about anti-corporations and then the anti of the healthcare industry, but definitely a motivation, definitely political, sending a message with the killing. So definitely, I would definitely put that in the terrorism realm.
And right now, his guilt and innocence is still being adjudicated, but do we have any idea of how Luigi allegedly got radicalized? Like, how did he get there? Do we have a sense of his path to that yet?
Yeah, well, the only path, there were like 6 months that he kind of went silent. Nobody heard or knew of him. So it may have been during that period, but he was posting things before that about, apparently had a back issue, but then he had some operation where he posted, everything went well. So it's still, kind of the mystery. And it might be that it was self-radicalization. But see, even that term, which all terrorism analysts use and media and policymakers use, radicalization, we really don't even know what that technically means. So we have free speech. So let us say somebody is radicalized, so they start posting things on internet or they say certain things. What's the key thing? What's the trigger point?
Yeah.
Changes them from the right to say what you like to then actually committing the act. And that has also differed, across the spectrum.
I think we all have friends that you'll see them post something. That one friend, you see him post, like, what's he doing? What's he posting? Why is he doing that? Like, in today's the world we live in today, it's easy to say, oh God, that guy's going to be a mass shooter, or that person's going to blow something up. But the percentage of people who actually move to that, from angry posting online to actual action, it's pretty low, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And the thing also, and what could help, police and the intelligence agencies, is that many of the lone wolves, they call it leakage, will actually say something that's beyond, like we're just posting. They're saying, I'm going to go kill such people, or, I want to go to the school. And there was enough warning signs from friends and family that it's more than, somebody just expressing their political extremist views or whatever, that they're actually at the point now where there's erratic behavior and so forth. But again, it hasn't been put to a science, where you can really totally predict it.
It's interesting, like that concept of leakage is very much not exclusive to terrorists, right? Any kind of killer or violent criminal often will tip their hat. That's sort of the first sign. That's sort of like the pre-shocks before the earthquake, right?
Yeah.
And if you know what to look for, well, I mean, it's always tough to know what to look for and who to take seriously, but it gets me thinking, the people who actually take the step, commit these terror attacks, there has to be a mental illness at play here, right? Like there's, it's not just, I believe in this cause and my cause is just, therefore I will act. Is there generally some sort of underlying mental illness or personality disorder underpinning this?
Well, for some, but not all. See, back in the old days, there was also the argument, well, terrorists are crazy because why would you kill, but they have in their own mind, the rationale that they're at war with the enemy. So terrorists, they're from the Middle East, the US. So they weren't mentally ill. And actually a terrorist group would weed out somebody who's mentally ill because they could be a danger in terms of going off on their own or risking, security within the group. But the lone wolves, it's about 30% who have some emotional or mental illness. But that means you still got the others who are dedicated to a cause, and they believe that they're part of this group. They identify with ISIS. And so in that case, it's not so much that they're crazy, but it's the mentally ill lone wolves who there really doesn't seem to be any rationale for what they did that also caused major problems.
Yeah, and I mean, you have to ask how much of that can you buy? Like here in New Orleans, after the New Orleans attack, Jabbar pledged allegiance to ISIS, which was news to ISIS, and how much of that is actually, yes, I believe I'm going to, I'm doing this in the name of ISIS. How much of it is just sort of grandstanding or justification, to give them what they did meaning, right?
Yeah, exactly. In his case, he wanted to kill, I believe, either his ex-wife or his family. I mean, he was emotionally, he was a wreck. And so, but, for those first few days, the whole country is thinking, ISIS has now gotten, to the U.S. again. We're having, the ISIS threat. But I mean, they're a presence all around the world still, and mainly the very significant presence online, which still causes the threat. But he would have found something else. In the shooting at where was it? I think it was in Atlanta, when the perpetrator had almost a smorgasbord of causes. He said, I'm doing this for ISIS. I'm doing this for Al-Qaeda. Yeah. And that was the worst mass shooting until Las Vegas.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, there's not anything that we could say this is, the profile of the lone wolf. And there are still some in the terrorism field and others who don't see the lone wolf as serious a threat as the organized group, because there's a belief that the organized group is going to have better resources. They may have access to more devastating types of explosive or bombs, but the lone wolves have proved to be pretty devastating on their own.
Well, as you noted, they're almost impossible to build a defense against, right? Like international organizations, the organized or domestic organizations, organization is the key word there. You can defend against an organization. You can deploy intelligence assets. You can do counterterrorism. You can't really do counterterrorism against a lone wolf terrorist, right?
No, not at all. I mean, you want to look as much as you can for early warning signs in terms of, if you do have reports of erratic behavior, but then, everybody is saying, my office mate is acting erratic. My neighbor is erratic, must be a terrorism. So it becomes a problem. And the Irish Republican Army actually had one of the best quotes about the difficulty in dealing with terrorism. They attempted to assassinate Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And they failed. It was a failed bombing. She was not at this site when they thought she'd be there. So they issued this chilling statement the next day. Today, we were unlucky. But remember, we only have to be lucky once. You have to be lucky always.
Yeah.
And it's true. We can stop so many terrorist attacks, but the one that gets through is going to make it look like we're back to square one, in the battle against terrorism.
And I think Ramzi Youssef said something similar after he was captured for the first World Trade Center attack. He said something to the effect of, I may not have been successful this time, but, my compatriots will be successful next time.
Exactly. Right. And another thing about the lone wolves is that, there are different types of lone wolves in the sense of the day of the total lone wolf, let's say, who is isolated from everything, is basically gone because of social media and all the interactions and everything. The classic example of the total, complete, pure lone wolf was the Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski. He was active in the days before internet and social media. He sent off package bombs across the country. Unabomb, the name comes from universities and airlines, which were his kind of targets, but he also expanded to other types of targets. But when he wanted a manifesto published. It was in newspapers. And some argued, don't publish his manifesto. It's going to encourage others. But the argument for publishing it was that maybe it'll give clues to somebody of who this mysterious Unabomber is, and we'll be able to capture him.
Yeah.
So I think it was the New York Times, the Washington Post, actually published his manifesto, which was like a 60-page diatribe against the technological society we live in. And his brother read it and realized, wait, this writing style, phrases, that seems like Ted, brother Ted. I know from his letters and all that. And he went to a forensic analyst, linguistic, to show comparing the letters he had received and things like that. They said, yep, it's the same person. So reluctantly, David Kaczynski went and informed the authorities, and that led to the Unabomber's arrest.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing about that is the Unabomber wanted his manifesto published, and the only way to do it was through newspapers. Had it been today, even though he was against technology, he would have used technology and would have posted it on the internet. And then his brother would have seen it also. But maybe even sooner. Kaczynski might have been posting these things. He was active for 17 years. So he may have posted in the first year, and then the brother would have seen it. So lives could have been saved, ironically.
Yeah, he lived deep underground. It reminds me of Eric Rudolph almost as well, the Atlanta bomber. I don't know if he published a manifesto or got a manifesto out there, but he was very lone wolf as well, pre-internet.
Oh, totally. And also, similar to the case in the shooting, New York, he becomes an anti-hero. Eric Rudolph had a lot of postings on the internet in his favor. There was T-shirts, "Run, Rudolph, run." And he's running from, the authorities. So, sometimes, unfortunately, people kind of put this heroic status against people who perpetrate these acts, but they're dealing with issues that resonate with the public.
And I guess suppose it's with the technology we have today and the way people communicate. You look at forums like 4chan or whatnot, and there's a version of that for every ideology, right? The 4chan tends to be for incels and that kind of thing, but there's the Islamic version, there's the right wing version, there's a left wing version. Is the ability for others to encourage escalation into violent acts, is that causing an increase, or is that making it easier for these people to convert? Your community.
Yeah, because now, because of social media and the internet, people are tuned in more. Now they could get, wrong information, but without the internet, it would have been hard to gain access to these people. So those who want to, not necessarily is recruiting to your cause, but sort of get somebody to do various, violent acts or other kinds of things, it's an easier road today. It's like a whole different world.
We talked about lone wolves and how it's impossible to defend against. But I guess there are still terror organizations out there looking to do harm inside the borders of the United States.
Oh, yeah.
Al-Qaeda and ISIS are greatly diminished. What should we be worried about in that realm, in the organized realm? Who are the viable organizations that can do something, that are trying to do something right now?
Well, you have, white supremacists and, neo-Nazi type groups. But again, a lot of those are decentralized.
Yeah.
So in other words, they also can encourage the lone wolves. And we can't totally yet dismiss, the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, kind of threat in the presence. But, within organized groups or, what we call the terrorist groups, it's more, towards the right-wing extremists today.
And I mean, and this is not a political podcast and I don't want to make it one, but it's just, I think, objective to say that a lot of the people who were on the margins in those communities are now towards the edge of power or in power. And I think a defining characteristic of terrorism is being out of power, right? in some ways, or fighting against power. Like, how do these right-wing ideologies, these right-wing extremists, your Proud Boys, your Oath Keepers, the people, who have engaged in violent acts, or the neo-Nazis out west, are they emboldened? Are they empowered? Are they more likely to commit acts when they have sympathetic forces in power? Or are they less likely because they think that they have more to lose by diminishing themselves? Does that make sense?
Yeah. But I think whether who's ever in power or not, they still pose that threat, and they'll still be, committing the acts. I mean, the whole question, the pardoning of the January 6th, the insurrection, where when people see people who have attacked the police, get pardoned, that could send the wrong signal out there. And that's something that's happened, recently. It's hard to predict what's in store. And as I mentioned before, the next, and unfortunately, there will be attacks. It could come from anywhere. It could come from any part of the religious or the political spectrum, and we really wouldn't be able to say whether it is right wing, left wing, or a single type of issue, as happened with the New York attack.
I always like to end these with asking, what did I not ask that I should have? Well,
just in terms of the last book I wrote.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Yeah.
Again, just for a brief time, I mean, the last book I wrote, it came out last year, was called The Bulldog Detective, William J. Flynn and America's First War Against the Mafia, Spies, and Terrorists. So for this book, I did something a little different than I had before. And I looked back in history at a law enforcement official who was basically forgotten. And William Flynn was the head of the Secret Service in the early part of the 20th century. And he went after the mafia, and he went after spies, and he went after terrorists. And he was a remarkable individual that basically should have a little more recognition today. He basically was able to bring down the first mafia family in New York, the Morello Lupo gang. Because the Secret Service, they're going after counterfeiters, and the mafia was doing a lot of counterfeiting in those days. But they also did murders and extortion. But he was able to get convictions on counterfeiting that put them away for quite a long time.
And what's the time frame for this?
So the 1901 to about 1910.
That early?
Yeah, the Morello Lupo gang. Then Flynn became the deputy commissioner of the NYPD, New York Police Department, and he tried to reform the detective division there, but there's a lot of opposition from various higher ups and politicians, so he quit that. And then he was appointed, again, head of the Secret Service. Prior to that, he was head of the New York division of the Secret Service. So he becomes head of the whole Secret Service, and they are tasked with trying to help ferret out German spies and espionage before World War I. And Flynn formed an 11-man counter-espionage unit, and he put at the head of it one of his trusted men, Frank Burke. And they followed an individual, they weren't sure who he was, who came out of a building where they knew there were German diplomats and others hanging out, and he was carrying a briefcase. And they followed him onto the train. It was an L train in New York. And when the individual, his name was Albert, Dr. Albert, came to a stop, he realized the door's about to close. He had fallen asleep. So he looks up, oh my God, he runs out and leaves his briefcase on the seat. So Frank Burke decides, I don't know what's in it, but maybe there's something important. And he takes the briefcase and runs out. And he's running down the street with Albert now chasing him, because Albert now realizes somebody took my briefcase. So the Burke, who's a Secret Service agent, didn't want to get a scene right in the streets of New York. He jumps onto a streetcar and he tells the conductor, you see that crazy man running and yelling? It was, Dr. Albert waving his hands, give me my briefcase. Give me my briefcase. Said he created a scene on the elevated train. Keep going. He's going to cause a problem. So Burke was able to get away, went to Flynn's office. They opened up the briefcase, and it showed all these plans that the Germans had for sabotage on the docks, for causing strikes, and how Albert had a $27 million budget. And it was a major, major revelation.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know German intelligence was that sophisticated before World War I in that time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, World War II, yeah, but yeah.
Yeah, totally. And this made Flynn even more famous. And Flynn, knew how to use the media. He made movies. And then he becomes head of the Bureau of Investigation in 1919. And that was a forerunner to the FBI. It was called the BI. And then when Hoover became head of the Bureau of Investigation in 1924. 10 years later, he changed the name to Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. But before Hoover, it was Flynn who was running the Bureau of Investigation, and he went after the terrorist group, the Gallianists, who were responsible for, prior to their lone wolf attack on Wall Street in 1920, they had some of the most innovative terrorist attacks in history.
Were they anarchists? Was that their thing?
They were Italian anarchists, and they sent 30 package bombs, or tried to send 30 package bombs across the country in 1919. And these package bombs were disguised as gifts from Gimbo's department store, which was a major department store in those days. Now, what happened was they prepared 30 of them. They brought it to the post office, but they didn't realize they didn't have enough postage on some of them. So about 16 never got sent. A few did get sent. They exploded. One was at a senator's wife, injured her, and I think almost killed the maid, and it got published in the newspaper. So a postal worker who had seen those packages before and put them into the basement of the post office because there wasn't enough postage, is reading this on the subway train. In those days, there were midnight editions of newspapers. He went, "Oh my God, this is like the packages I put into the basement." So he runs, gets back there. They look at it. They say, these are bombs. And so even more, devastation was prevented. But it was a major news item because, this terrorist group, the Gallianists, was able to, send these bombs. And then to prove that they were really serious, they wanted to try to prevent the deportation of their leader, Luigi Galliani, who was eventually deported. But they commit another attack. This time it was on June 2nd, 1919, where they set off 9 bombs in 7 cities, including walking up the steps of the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, at his home. There was no security at all there, but the terrorists tripped, the bomb went off, and he was killed. But these bombs were a wake-up call, to America that we got a serious domestic terrorist threat here. But then nothing happened for about a year and a half, and then we had the Wall Street bombing. But it was a interesting case study, in terms of, going after the terrorists. Now, Flynn, his later years after he was finished with government service, created a magazine called Flynn's. It was a detective magazine. Mm-hmm. It was the most popular detective magazine in the country. And he told about his stories. He published new writers. One of the new writers he published was Agatha Christie, before Agatha Christie was famous. And then Flynn died of a heart attack in 1928. But he was a remarkable...
A hell of a life, yeah.
Oh, wow, yeah. And the picture of him, he was almost looked like, for the older audience would remember Orson Welles, what Orson Welles looked like. He was just really heavy set, but, had a interesting kind of face. And just this, interesting story. So it was fun doing that book. And so
everything you just talked about, early mob, Italian anarchists, German, counterintelligence, I am a nerd for. What's the name of the book again?
The Bulldog Detective, William J. Flynn and America's First War Against the Mafia, Spies, and Terrorists.
We'll put a link to that in the description of the podcast and the video.
Yeah, and also what I'm doing now, to just make quickly, is that I'm working on a new book that's totally different than what I've done before. And this is a biography. Again, the younger audience may not have heard of him, but older ones might have. F. Lee Bailey, who was one of the most charismatic and famous criminal lawyers in the middle of the last century. He and the issues he worked on, the cases, still have resonance today, including the right to a fair trial. He defended Samuel Shepard, who was the basis for the TV show and the movie The Fugitive.
Yep.
And he defended the Boston Strangler. And he also, and here's the terrorism angle, defended Patty Hearst, who was kidnapped by the SLA. And of course, he was involved with the OJ case.
OJ, of course,
But his story is sort of a riches to rags story where he became so famous, but then he died penniless and living upstairs from his girlfriend, who was a hairdresser. He lost everything, But it was an interesting journey that he went through.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us. This is a great chat. And, again, everyone go read the books. They'll be in the description below. Thanks again.
Thank you.